The air inside the house still smelled faintly of lavender and lemon wood polish, her mother's signature scent combination. Emily stepped inside cautiously, like she was entering a memory rather than a place. The creak of the floorboard near the entrance hadn't changed, and for a split second, she expected to hear her mother's voice floating in from the kitchen, asking if she wanted tea. But the house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels dense, like it's filled with things left unsaid. It had been 2 months since her mother's funeral. 2 months since Emily had watched the casket disappear into the earth and felt her heart cave in. And yet here she was, back in the home where she had spent every summer holiday and awkward teenage Christmas. She wasn't sure what she was hoping to feel. Maybe a little comfort, maybe a little closure. Mostly, she just wanted to pick up the things her mother had promised her in the will, the ones with more emotional value than material. She wasn't here for furniture or jewelry or anything extravagant, just the box of letters they used to write each other when Emily was away at college. The ceramic music box shaped like a ballerina that had lived on her mother's dresser since the 90s. And most of all, the wedding ring, gold, simple, with a small emerald set in the center instead of diamond. Her mother never liked diamonds, she'd said. Too cold, too predictable. The emerald had been her favorite stone, and it was her father who had chosen it. Her real father, the one who died when Emily was 10. That ring meant more to Emily than anyone could have understood. It was her mother's connection to her first love, to a time when life was simpler and whole. When her stepfather Rick entered their lives 3 years after the funeral, he had been kind at first, gentle even. He never tried to replace Emily's father, and for a while, that felt like a blessing. But as the years went on, Rick's presence had become more possessive. He started taking more control of household finances, suggesting Emily apply for fewer grants and rely on him for real support. Her mother, maybe out of weariness, maybe out of gratitude, slowly gave in. Still, she had always drawn a line around her wedding ring. That stays with Emily, she'd said more than once. It belongs with her, not in some safe or on my finger after I'm gone. With her. And Emily had taken that to heart. So when she walked into her mother's old bedroom and opened the drawer of the walnut dresser, her stomach dropped. The velvet box was gone. She froze, hands still hovering over the drawer's edge. The little burgundy box with the silk lining, the one that had always been nestled under a stack of cotton scarves, wasn't there. The scarves were folded neatly, just as her mother had left them. But the ring box was missing. She checked the other drawers, the closet, even under the bed. Nothing. Her breath came faster, not quite panic, but a tight anxiety building in her chest. She tried to rationalize. Maybe Rick had moved it for safekeeping. Maybe he had taken it out to polish or preserve it. But she hadn't seen him wear gloves or be the sentimental type. In fact, he'd seemed in a rush to clear out most of her mother's belongings after the funeral. Emily had pushed back then, insisting on a slower, more thoughtful process. They'd compromised on a storage unit, but she was sure, absolutely sure, that the ring had been left here. She remembered seeing it in the drawer just a week before the funeral. She had checked, just to be sure it was safe. With a mix of dread and restrained anger, she called Rick's name. He was downstairs in the den, watching a sports recap show with the volume up too high, as usual. When he didn't answer right away, she descended the stairs and found him sprawled on the recliner, a half-empty can of soda balanced on the armrest. "Rick," she said, try to keep her tone steady. "Do you know where Mom's wedding ring is?" He glanced at her, slow and casual. "What ring?" Her throat tightened. "The emerald one. The one Dad gave her. It used to be in her top drawer. In the velvet box." Rick made a show of thinking for a moment, then shrugged. "Must have gotten packed with the other jewelry stuff. I don't remember seeing it." "It wasn't packed," she replied firmly. "I checked before the funeral. It was there." He picked up the remote and muted the TV. His posture stiffened, just enough to betray a hint of discomfort. "Look, Emily, I've been going through a lot too. Maybe it got misplaced. Maybe someone else took it. We had a lot of people in and out of the house, remember? Nurses, hospice workers, your cousin Jen." Emily's eyes narrowed. Jen wouldn't steal, and none of the nurses would have gone through drawers. Rick shrugged again, this time more dismissively. "Then I don't know what to tell you." She stared at him, her mind racing. There was something in the way he avoided her eyes. A flinch, a hesitation. Rick wasn't a good liar. He never had been. He covered his tracks with indifference, hoping people would just give up and stop asking questions. But Emily wasn't going to stop asking. That night, she drove back to her apartment and sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through pawnshop directories. It felt absurd, even humiliating, but something in her gut told her she'd find the answer there. She searched listings by zip code, using filters for emerald rings, gold bands, anything close in description. Most sites had nothing useful. But one small pawnshop on the outskirts of town had a listing posted 2 weeks ago, a gold band with an emerald center, no engraving, appraised at $3,800. The photo wasn't clear enough to be certain, but it was close. Very close. Emily called the shop the next morning. She asked about the ring, said she might be interested in buying it, and inquired casually about who sold it. The man on the phone was polite but firm. No seller information could be given without a legal inquiry. However, he did confirm that the ring had been purchased by a man named Rick M. and had been sold the day after the funeral. Emily hung up slowly, her blood pounding in her ears. There was no longer any doubt. Rick had taken her mother's ring, the one thing that was supposed to be hers, and sold it. He hadn't just sold it. He sold it the day after the funeral, like it meant nothing, like it was just a trinket gathering dust. And he hadn't said a word. What kind of person does that? She sat motionless for a long time, numbness giving way to anger. But even then, a deeper question emerged. Why? Why had he needed the money so quickly? He wasn't broke. Her mother had left a modest life insurance policy, and Rick had a stable job with the local maintenance department. It wasn't adding up. Later that week, Emily went to visit her friend Casey, who worked at a boutique jewelry store downtown. They were close in college, and Casey still owed her a favor. Over coffee, Emily explained the situation, then pulled out her phone and showed her the pawn listing. Casey squinted, then her eyes widened. She had seen a ring just like that. Not long ago. But more importantly, she had recently appraised a diamond necklace that a woman brought in for insurance purposes. She wasn't sure, but she thought the customer's name was Sasha. And she was wearing a ring too, brand new. Emily's stomach churned. Rick's girlfriend. Rick had a girlfriend, and she was wearing new jewelry. Emily didn't sleep that night. Her body lay in bed, unmoving, but her thoughts stormed behind her eyes like a flood she couldn't dam. The image of that pawnshop listing haunted her. So did Rick's blank expression and dismissive tone when she'd asked about the ring. But what kept circling in her mind like a vulture was one name, Sasha. That was the woman Casey had mentioned. A customer who brought in a newly purchased necklace for insurance appraisal. Rick's girlfriend. Emily hadn't even known he was dating anyone. Then again, she'd pulled away from him emotionally after her mother's health began to decline, trusting he'd at least keep her mother's last wishes intact. Now it felt like she'd made a mistake too big to fix. The next day, Emily stopped by the jewelry store where Casey worked. Casey greeted her with a hesitant smile, and for good reason. What they were about to do wasn't exactly standard procedure. Emily had explained everything. The missing ring, the sale to the pawn shop, and the suspicion that Rick had used the money to spoil someone else. Casey offered to look through the store's client logbook to verify if Sasha had really come in for an appraisal and what she'd brought with her. Emily watched as her friend flipped through the pages with quick fingers, finally stopping near the bottom of a page marked 2 weeks ago. There, Casey said, tapping lightly. Sasha D. She didn't write a full last name, but the receipt has the initials RM under the purchaser name. Emily's heart sank. RM Rick Martin. That was all the proof she needed. Her stepfather had sold her mother's wedding ring and used the money to buy another woman a diamond necklace. Casey glanced up. The necklace was custom. White gold. 2-carat center diamond. He must have spent close to $4,000. Emily nodded mutely. Her hands clenched at her lap. She wasn't even surprised anymore. Just hollow, like something inside her had been ripped out. She left the store in silence, clutching a copy of the appraisal receipt Casey had quietly printed for her. It wasn't exactly legal evidence, but it was a start. Emily knew she'd have to play this smart. She couldn't just confront Rick and expect justice. He'd deny everything, spin stories, maybe even accuse her of invading his privacy. She needed to build something solid, undeniable. So she decided to wait, to watch, to gather facts like puzzle pieces until the picture became too clear to ignore. Over the next few days, Emily began quietly asking around. She contacted a friend who worked part-time at the bar, where Rick sometimes played darts with his buddies. Another acquaintance who managed the town's small insurance office. Everyone was discreet, and most didn't offer much. But what she did hear confirmed what she feared. Rick had been openly dating Sasha for at least 2 months. Apparently, it had started before her mother passed away. The rumor was that he'd met her at a home renovation project where he worked. Sasha was younger, maybe mid-30s, with bleached blonde hair and a loud laugh. Not exactly the shy widow type. One person even mentioned seeing Rick and Sasha together at a local steakhouse just a week after the funeral. He wasn't grieving, Emily realized. He had already moved on. The ring hadn't been an oversight or a moment of weakness. It was a decision. A cold one. A selfish one. The thought lit a fuse in her chest. Grief gave way to rage. That weekend, Emily did something she hadn't done in a long time. She went to her mother's gravesite. It was a gray morning, and the cemetery was empty except for a groundskeeper trimming bushes in the far corner. She knelt beside the simple marble headstone, brushing her fingers across her mother's engraved name. Martha Lynn Cooper, beloved mother, devoted friend. She closed her eyes, letting the silence wrap around her. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered. "I should have protected it. I should have been more careful." Tears slipped down her cheeks, not just from sadness, but from guilt. Her mother had trusted Rick, maybe even loved him in her own way. And Emily had let that trust carry her into complacency. Now the one object that symbolized her parents' love was gone, sold like a trinket to fund some flashy gesture for a woman who didn't even know its meaning. But she wasn't going to let that be the end of the story. Back home, Emily pulled out her mother's will from a file folder she kept in a lockbox. She read through it carefully, looking for any reference to the ring. And there it was, line 7 of the personal effects section. "To my daughter Emily, I leave my wedding ring and the contents of my jewelry box in remembrance of her father and our family." Clear, undeniable. It was her property, legally and morally. She photocopied the will, then wrote a letter to the pawn shop requesting the original sales record for the emerald ring, citing legal ownership and offering to purchase the item back if it hadn't yet been resold. Days passed without a response. Finally, she got a short email. The ring was sold to a third-party buyer 1 week after intake. "We do not have return options once the item is transferred." Just like that, it was gone. For good. Emily sat frozen in front of her laptop. There would be no recovery. No last-minute buyback. But that didn't mean Rick would walk away clean. Not now. She pulled out her phone and took a long breath before dialing her attorney's number. He was an old friend of the family, someone who had handled her mother's estate. She explained the situation calmly, presenting the facts one by one. He listened carefully, then asked if she had proof that Rick sold the ring, and if she had legal documentation proving it was hers. She said yes to both. "I can draft a small claims suit," he said. "It's theft, Emily. If the will names you, and he sold it without your permission, we've got grounds. But I don't want the money," she replied quietly. "I just want accountability. Then we'll get both." That night, Emily took one final step. She drove past Rick's house. He'd moved into a newer place in the neighboring suburb, clearly enjoying the fruits of whatever money he'd made off her mother's things. A sleek SUV sat in the driveway. There were string lights on the porch. And through the front window, Emily saw them, Rick and Sasha, sitting on the couch. She was wearing the necklace. The light caught the diamond just right, and it sparkled like a shard of ice against her chest. Emily didn't cry this time. She didn't rage or hit the steering wheel. She just stared, then quietly drove away. She had seen enough. This wasn't about mourning anymore. This was about respect, about dignity, about making sure that the person who had taken something sacred and traded it for selfish gain would not go unchallenged. She was ready. Emily sat in the stiff leather chair in her attorney's office, her fingers tightly gripping the folded copy of her mother's will. A steaming mug of untouched coffee sat on the glass table before her. growing cold just like the numbness that had settled in her chest. She was past the point of heartbreak now. The last few weeks had replaced the ache of loss with something sharper, conviction. She had all the proof, and now she had to act. Across from her sat Daniel Kessler, a seasoned estate attorney who had helped settle her mother's affairs after the funeral. He had kind eyes, and though his tone was always measured, Emily could tell he was outraged on her behalf. He had reviewed the documents she brought, including the will, the appraisal receipt from Casey, the pawnshop email confirming Rick as the seller, and the photographs of Sasha wearing the necklace in public. "It's pretty clear-cut," he said, glancing again at the highlighted section of the will. "Your mother legally designated that ring to you. Rick had no right to sell it. That's not just unethical, it's illegal. It's considered conversion under civil law. You could argue for damages based on sentimental value, but most likely we'll pursue replacement value plus punitive compensation for emotional distress." Emily nodded slowly. "I don't care about the money. I just don't want him to think he got away with it." Daniel smiled gently. "Then you've come to the right place." They spent the next 2 hours drawing up the complaint. It would be filed in small claims court, which meant the process would be quicker, though limited in monetary scope. Still, it would force Rick to appear in front of a judge and answer for what he'd done. Emily signed the papers with a sense of finality, her name crisp and purposeful on the line. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she was doing something her mother would have been proud of. The following week was a blur of legal preparation. Emily received a notice that Rick had been formally served, and he had responded with a notice to contest the claim. Typical. She half expected him to lie or twist the story somehow. And sure enough, just days later, she received a thin envelope in the mail, a copy of Rick's formal response to the court. In it, he claimed that the ring had been in shared property and that Emily had not retrieved her items within a reasonable time, thus forfeiting them. He also implied financial hardship and emotional instability due to his wife's death, suggesting he had acted in a moment of confusion. He painted himself as grieving and overwhelmed, framing the jewelry purchase as a misguided coping mechanism. Emily read the statement twice, her hands trembling. It was insulting. He wasn't grieving. He was dating someone before the funeral. He had the nerve to reduce her mother's last wishes to a matter of timing and accuse her, the daughter who sat by her mother's bedside for the last 6 weeks of her life, of abandoning her inheritance. He even had the audacity to claim that Sasha was a close family friend, conveniently omitting the fact that she hadn't even attended the funeral. This wasn't just about a ring anymore. It was about rewriting history, about silencing the truth with a paper trail of lies. But Emily had come prepared. When the court date arrived, she walked into the small municipal courtroom wearing a simple black dress and holding a carefully organized binder of evidence. Rick was already seated at the defendant's table, wearing a pressed button-down shirt and a look of false remorse. Sasha wasn't with him. That surprised Emily. Maybe he didn't want to expose her to the process. Or maybe Sasha, like the necklace she now wore, was just something temporary. The judge, an older woman with salt and pepper hair and wire-framed glasses, called the session to order. The courtroom was nearly empty, save for a few spectators and a reporter scribbling notes in the back row. Emily spoke first. She laid out her case, clearly. The existence of her mother's will, the specific item bequeathed to her, the timeline of events, the pawnshop confirmation of Rick's sale, and the documented purchase of new jewelry for his girlfriend using funds from that transaction. She included the letter from the pawnshop, a notarized copy of the will, and the receipt Casey had secured from the appraisal. She kept her voice calm, but her words carried weight. When Rick was asked to respond, he cleared his throat dramatically and began his performance. He spoke of the funeral, of the overwhelming task of sorting through decades of memories, of sleepless nights and mounting bills. He admitted to selling some items, but insisted it was done with every intention of replacing them. He claimed he hadn't realized the ring was in the drawer, that it must have been mixed in with Martha's things. He looked down often, strategically wiping his eyes. It was a show, and Emily knew it. But the judge wasn't moved. She looked at the documents again, then peered over her glasses at Rick. "Mr. Martin, this ring was named specifically in the will as a bequest to the plaintiff. Your wife passed away on July 3rd. You sold the ring on July 4th. Are you seriously suggesting you didn't have time to assess what belonged to your stepdaughter? Rick stammered. Well, Your Honor, I didn't read the will closely at the time. Yet you found time to sell a valuable piece of jewelry and purchase another item for a personal acquaintance? Rick turned red. That had nothing to do with it. I was just trying to deal with everything. Emily held her breath. The judge exhaled and sat back in her chair. Intentional or not, the facts are clear. The defendant took possession of an item not legally his, sold it for profit, and used the proceeds for unrelated personal spending. This constitutes conversion and violation of the terms of the will. Rick's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. The judge turned to Emily. Miss Cooper, do you wish to pursue emotional damages in addition to material compensation? Emily shook her head. No, Your Honor. I just want acknowledgement and repayment of the ring's value. The judge nodded. Then I hereby rule in favor of the plaintiff. The defendant is ordered to pay the replacement value of $4,000 as appraised, plus court costs. Payment is to be completed within 30 days. A small gasp escaped Emily's throat. It was done. She had won, not just in the legal sense, but morally. She had stood up to the man who had betrayed her mother's memory and tried to make her feel powerless. And she had done it with dignity, facts, and resolve. Rick didn't look at her as she left the courtroom. He kept his head down, scribbling on a notepad, pretending not to notice. Maybe he couldn't face her, or maybe he still didn't understand what he had destroyed. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. As Emily stepped outside into the sunlight, a soft breeze rustled her coat. She didn't feel triumphant exactly. There was still grief under the surface. The ring was still gone, but she had made sure that her mother's last wish had not been erased. She had honored the promise they made. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table and pulled out a small framed photo of her mother and father on their wedding day. Her mother had been radiant, the emerald ring glinting on her finger. Her father, tall and serious, held her hand like it was the most sacred thing in the world. Emily lit a candle beside the photo and whispered, "It's done, Mom. He won't get away with it." She didn't know yet what she would do with the money. She hadn't thought that far ahead, but she knew it wouldn't go toward another ring. This wasn't about replacing what was lost. It was about reclaiming what never should have been taken. The check arrived in the mail 11 days after the court ruling. It was folded in a plain white envelope with Rick's sloppy handwriting on the front, addressed to Emily Cooper in shaky blue ink. There was no note inside. No epalegi. No explanation. Just the bank-issued slip for $4,000 and a sense of finality that hit harder than she expected. Emily stood at her kitchen counter holding the check between her fingers. The weight of it was nearly nothing, and yet it carried everything. The betrayal, the fight, the courtroom victory, the quiet anger that had been smoldering since she opened her mother's drawer and found the ring gone. She had won, on paper at least, but as she stared at the money, her chest fell hollow. The victory hadn't brought her peace. The ring was still lost to the world, sitting on the hand of some woman who didn't even know what it meant. And that would never change. She placed the check down gently and sat in silence for nearly an hour, the hum of her refrigerator the only sound in the room. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just sat, letting the stillness settle around her like dust. That evening, she opened a drawer and pulled out a small, weathered notebook, her mother's journal. It wasn't full of secrets or dramatic confessions, just scattered thoughts and grocery lists and lines of poetry copied from books. But inside the back cover, Emily had once read something that stayed with her. The things we love don't live in objects. They live in what we do because of them. Her mother had scribbled that sentence sometime in 2016, probably after watching some sentimental film, or maybe just remembering Emily's father. But now those words felt like an answer. The ring was a symbol, but what mattered more was how she responded to the loss. What she chose to do because it had been taken. The next morning, Emily walked through the old part of town, past the bus stop where she used to wait for her high school rides, past the corner bakery where her mother bought cinnamon rolls every Sunday after church. It was strange how the town never changed even when everything else had. She stopped at a red brick building with a peeling green door. Above it, a faded sign read Safe Haven Women's Shelter. She'd passed by it 100 times and never gone inside. But today she did. The receptionist at the front desk looked up with a warm smile. "Can I help you?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. I'd like to make a donation, and I'd like to talk to someone about starting something new here, in memory of my mother." An hour later, she walked out feeling lighter than she had in months. The director had nearly cried when Emily explained her idea: to donate the full $4,000 to launch a small legal assistance fund for women whose personal items were stolen or misused by family members, especially in estate matters. The fund would help them pay legal fees, recover property, and educate them about inheritance rights. It would be called Martha's Memory. Emily knew her mother would have loved the idea. She'd always believed in protecting the vulnerable, in standing up for what was right even when it was uncomfortable. Creating something good out of something so cruel felt like restoring a balance the world had lost. In the weeks that followed, Emily poured herself into organizing the launch. She designed flyers, partnered with a local lawyer to offer pro bono consultations once a month, and even reached out to the city council for support. Surprisingly, several women came forward, sharing eerily similar stories. Rings taken, wills ignored, sentimental items sold off by relatives who thought no one would fight back. It opened Emily's eyes to a quiet epidemic of small betrayals, often dismissed because they weren't big enough for court. But for the women who lived through them, they were devastating. One woman, Lynette, tearfully recounted how her brother sold their late grandmother's antique pendant to fund his wedding without telling her. Another, Maria, said her stepmother pawned a necklace given to her on her quinceañera, claiming it had no real value. Each story reminded Emily that she hadn't just been avenging a ring. She had joined a chorus of unheard voices. Meanwhile, Rick had all but vanished from her life. He never called, never wrote. Word around town was that Sasha had left him shortly after the court ruling. Apparently, she hadn't known where the necklace money had come from and was furious when she found out. Emily didn't know if that was true or just a convenient rumor, but she didn't care enough to confirm it. Whatever happened to them was no longer her burden to carry. One afternoon, as she was leaving a Martha's Memory outreach session at the community center, she received a call from the pawn shop. A man named Edgar, the owner, said he remembered her case and had something she might want to hear. Curious and cautious, Emily drove to the shop that evening. It was a cramped place, full of trinkets and tarnished dreams, the kind of store where nothing matched, and yet everything had a story. Edgar greeted her at the door. "I shouldn't really be telling you this," he began, lowering his voice, but the woman who bought that emerald ring returned it a few days ago. Said it didn't feel right wearing it. Gave no name, just dropped in a box and walked out. Emily's breath caught. He pulled out a small velvet case. Red, not burgundy, but familiar in shape. Inside was the ring. Her mother's ring. Gold band. Emerald center. No inscription, just as she remembered it. "I was going to melt it down," Edgar said, "but then I remembered your face. Thought you might want a chance." Emily reached out and touched it, then hesitated. She stared at the ring, heart pounding. "How much?" she whispered. He shrugged. "300 even. Less than what I gave for it. But I figure it belongs to you." She paid in cash. When she stepped outside into the fading sunlight, she didn't cry. She just held the ring in her palm for a long time, feeling its weight settle gently into the center of her chest, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. It wasn't about possession anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. This moment was about restoration, about finishing a story that had been interrupted. That evening, she placed the ring in a small glass case on her bookshelf, beside her mother's photo and a printout of the Martha's Memory brochure. She didn't plan to wear it. It wasn't meant for show. It was meant to stay still, exactly where it belonged. In the quiet, she thought of all the ways grief changes people, how it bends them, breaks them, sometimes corrupts them, but could also forge strength. It could spark clarity. And in her case, it had created something enduring. Not just a legal win, not just a returned heirloom, but a legacy. Her mother was gone, but her memory lived on, in every woman helped, in every piece of stolen dignity reclaimed. And that was worth more than any emerald.